We are the Addressing Health team. There's a few of us. Myself, you've already met two or three of the other members of the team, but there's Professor Nicholas Shelton from UCL, Dr. Douglas Brown from Kingston, Dr. Kathleen McElvenna from the University of Derby, and Holly Marley, who's our second PhD student. And that's in addition to Natasha, Laura, and Harry. These are our partner universities. It's a project which is funded by the Wellcome Trust for 3 years. We're just started our second year, and we work in close partnership with the Postal Museum, of which Emily is the representative on the project. So what I'm going to do is, that's who we are. I'm going to explain what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, which is a challenge in COVID itself, and how you can help as well. This is what we look like, just in case you didn't know. And there is our partner with the Postal Museums, Emily. And this is the rest of the team, which includes you. We've been working with the University of the Third Age for several months now, and that's been a really productive, really fantastic collaboration. We've also been working with Postal Museum volunteers ever since the start of the project, way back in, well, it seems ages ago now. It was actually March last year that we were started work. And we've also have a large number of Zooniverse volunteers. Some of you might have come through the Zooniverse route. We launched our project on Zooniverse at the end of last month, but we hope that we will have more of the pension records, which is what is up on Zooniverse, for transcription in the coming months. I'll speak more about that later. If you've participated in the Zooniverse project, you probably will have encountered Harry, who was largely responsible for setting up all the workflows and may have been responding to the notes in the chat. So this is who we are, and you are very much part of the team. We work together, and we can't do this without you. So what are we trying to do? The project has 3 main workflows. The first looks at sickness and retirement in the post office in the second half of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. For a sample of the workers in the post office who retired, we're working with pensioners from the post office. We track them through to their death using the death certificates. So we want to know, once they left work, how long did they survive? What was the link between, if any, between their death, cause of death, and their cause of retirement? That's the second work stream. And we have a third work stream, which is very much to look at the individual and institutional responses to sickness and health in the post office itself. Natasha and Holly are involved in that in particular. So we have these 3 different work streams. One's looking at retirement and the cause of retirement. The other is looking at the post-retirement to death phase. And the third section is looking at the institutional, the worker responses to the problems of health in the post office. They might say, well, why the post office? What's so special about it? Well, there's several reasons. First of all, it's a national institution. So it covers the entire United Kingdom, includes Ireland at this time. And it has, and this just shows you on the right-hand side, this map of post office, of sick workers. This just shows you that we have coverage all the way from north of Scotland, all the way down to Cornwall and Penzance down here, and across Ireland. It's got a very large workforce. It's one of the largest employers in the country. There's over 167,000 workers in 1900, about 1 in 5 of which were women. And the occupations it covers spans the humble letter carrier, the postman, postwomen, all the way up to the Postmaster General. So it's got a really big range of different status occupations. London was the centre of its operations, so about a third of the entire mail came through the city, and London also had around about a third of the workforce, but a larger proportion of the clerks and the telegraphists. So it's large, it's varied, it has both men and women, and it covers the entire social spectrum. Surprisingly, when people have looked at health at the workplace in the 19th and 20th centuries, they've tended to focus on the dangerous trades, mining in particular, but chemical works, fishing, rather than the white collar or the service sector, which actually was the fastest growing sector of the economy. So we're looking at the service sector, and it's a very different type of story to those very dangerous trades that we know a little bit more about. And the reason why we're interested in health and trying to understand health at work is that almost everything we know about health in the 19th and early 20th centuries actually comes from what we know about death. When somebody died after 1837, their details were recorded civilly in civil registration, and that then produced the death registers produced by the Registrar General. And most of what we know about health comes from the death side of things. But what killed you doesn't necessarily isn't necessarily what forced you to stop working in the first place. So we're interested in what people suffered with, and for some of them we're interested in what they died from, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So how are we trying to look at health in the workplace? Well, the post office, like other civil servant, parts of the civil service, used to pay a pension. So from the 1850s, a worker who had served for 10 years in the postal service was eligible for a pension, and their record of sickness was noted down as well as the cause of retirement. And they appear in individual letters, which are bound into these volumes, which are the Treasury letters, which are stuck in the archives of the Postal Museum. So we haven't been able to get at them since the project started, because COVID has basically taken up the last year. And inside each of these boxes is a volume like this. And inside this volume is a record like this. This is a pension record. This is what we hoped we would be working with. This is a man called Charles Garlick. He was a postman in Manchester. He retired on the 31st of October in 1890, and his pension record tells us a lot about his working life. It gives us the place of work, how long he worked for, how much he earned. It also gives us the reason why he retired. So in this case, he actually retired because he had an ulcer of the stomach. And there was a medical certificate which would have been enclosed, but which no longer survives. And then you get a story about his work in the post office. And then you have a little table here, which shows you the sickness, the amount of days he took off for sickness in the 10 years prior to him retiring. And we're very interested in all of this information. But unfortunately, it is stuck in the archives and we can't get access to it at present, at least not all of the records. We're working from a period of between 1858 and 1908. And if you've been on the Zooniverse site, you will have transcribed perhaps 5 years worth of data. We've got another 45 years worth of transcription to do, but we can only do that when we photograph these records. Well, just taking Charles Garlick a little bit further, he's one of the people that we may well be tracing through to his death certificate. So here we have his death certificate. He died actually in 1920 So he lived another 30 years after his retirement. He obviously survived his ulcer, and he eventually died of arteriosclerosis and senile decay. But it was recorded that he was a retired post office official, and he died at quite a ripe old age at that time of 78. So we know quite a lot about him, where he lived, and where he worked, how long he worked for, why he retired, and ultimately what his sickness record was and what he died from. Okay, this is where COVID comes in. So from last March, the archives have essentially been closed. So we very quickly had to change the way we get this information. And we discovered two sources. One was the handwritten pension index, and the other was a set of parliamentary papers. Our wonderful volunteers have transcribed over 21,000 lines of information from these pension records, which give us the name and the occupation and the place of work of all those who retired from post office. By combining that information with a series of tables that appear each year in the parliamentary papers, and we had to manipulate this using optical character recognition to create spreadsheets, when Harry's been very busy linking the two together, we can add some more information about their salary, their age of retirement, their length of service, and the reason why they retired, which is mostly there, not always, and also how much they got as a pension. So we can actually put together quite a lot of information using these two different sources rather than the original records that we really wanted to use. So to borrow a football analogy, which I think is quite popular on the daily briefings, if you've seen Dr. Van Tam, at halftime, it's Addressing Health 2. There are 2 goals. COVID nil. COVID has not stopped us from ploughing ahead with the project. However, there's still a lot to play for. So what can we learn from all of this? What can we tell you? And this is some very preliminary results from the information that we've been gathering together. So we can look at different occupations and we can compare their ages of retirement. And we can also look at the average percent that had to retire because of ill health. So let's take the postmaster and postmistresses. They were at the top of the apex. They usually worked well into their 60s, and many of them worked into their 70s. And we even have records of postmistresses working into their 90s. They retired in their 60s, and relatively speaking, around about 15 to 20% retired because of ill health. But look at the other end of the spectrum. Look at the majority of workers who are the postmen and the sorting clerks, and down here the telegraphists. If you were a postman or a sorter, and many of these would have been in large towns, and London especially, you were lucky to get into your mid-50s. And if you were a sorter, you were lucky to get into your mid-40s before you were forced to retire. And the main reason why they retired was because of ill health. So a postman, around about 40 to 50%, 60 to 70% of postmen retired because they were unfit to work. And for sorters, that went up to nearly 90%. So 90%, 9 out of 10 sorters retired early because of ill health. So we're beginning to unpick that occupations had a very important impact on the pattern of ill health. What about that geography side of things? Well, we've just started to put together some of the data that all the volunteers have been transcribing for us. And we're beginning to see the pattern. On the left-hand side, you'll see a map which Harris produced, which shows you the retirements because of ill health, medical retirements between 1861 and 1887. The dark areas show you the areas where between 56 and 80% of the reasons for retirement were because of poor health. Here is London. This is Manchester and Liverpool. We have some unusual patterns also in Ireland and in South Wales, but on the east coast of the country, many fewer workers are retiring because of ill health, the lighter areas here, and in particular up in northeast of Scotland. So we have an interesting geographical pattern. We can break that down by the size of place. So if we compare, say, London with rural areas, these are places that had less than 10,000 people. And this is from our pilot survey that we carried out a couple of years ago, but we're pulling more data into this the whole time. In London, around about 70% of all workers retired because of ill health, compared to less than 50% in rural areas. Large cities were more like London, small market towns were more like the countryside. So there's an interesting geography about size, location in the country, which helps to explain patterns of ill health. But was this to do with the kind of work? Working in London as a sorter or as a postman was quite stressful. There was a large volume of mail. They worked in very poorly lit, very poorly ventilated offices. They worked split shifts, late into the night, very early in the morning. It was a stressful occupation. Or was it because of the conditions in which they lived? In the second half of the 19th century, although things were improving, there was still a long way to go. And certainly in large cities like Liverpool and Manchester and London, we have very poor environments, living environments. And postal workers weren't paid a huge amount, so they would have struggled to live in some of the better areas of cities like London. This is a question that we don't know the answer to yet, but we will by the time we finish our project. What else do we know? Well, one possibility is actually that the diagnosis of ill health may have been something to do with the doctors who were employed by the post office. The post office set up a medical service in 1855, and there were post office doctors permanently employed in London, but part-time elsewhere in the country. Was it that they were diagnosing ill health in different ways? Well, interestingly, when you start looking at the terminologies they were using, and we've just picked out 3 terms here, which are general terms. One is debility, one is infirm, and the other is worn out. These are terms that the doctors use to describe the reason for retirement. Oops, sorry. Let's just look at this area here, where the term infirm is used. And most of the workers who retired because they were infirm were in Scotland or Ireland, and particularly the northern part of Ireland. In England and Wales, the term that doctors tended to use would be debility or just worn out. So we have to think of the possibility that the diagnosis of ill health may be something to do with the way doctors were trained. And that's the subject of one of our PhD projects. So it's not just about ill health, it's about the diagnosis of ill health as well. Well, let's go to that bit of the record that we can't get from our other sources. And that is the sickness record, the 10 years of sickness prior to retirement. Here is one of our postmistresses, those long-lived postmistresses, Elizabeth George. And we know quite a bit about her, actually. including the celebration of her retirement. How sick was she compared to our postman, Charles Garlick, who I introduced you to earlier? This is Elizabeth's pension record, and there is, on the right-hand side, her sickness table. Here she is. We even have a photograph of her. We've got a description of the celebration or commemoration of her retirement. She was well known in the post office at Tewkesbury. She was postmistress there. And when she retired at the age of 72, the subscribers and the staff and the local community clubbed together to give her a beautiful diamond and sapphire ring. She appears in our pension records down here, and we've got quite a lot of information about her. How sick was she, a postmistress, compared to our postman, Charles Garlick? Well, here is her postal, her service record, and what we know from her is that she only took 34 days sick, and all of those were in a single year, 1 year, 1896. There is a sickness record there. Charles Garlick, on the other hand, who retired because of an ulcer in the stomach, actually took 209 days off. So he was a much sicker individual than she was. Unfortunately, we can only get at this information by photographing the original records, which are currently under lock and key. So the score at present is Addressing Health 2, COVID 1. We can't get at what we want for this bit of the project until the archives reopen. And that sickness record is really important for us, because one of the things that we found out from some of our earlier work is that sickness rates varied depending on where you are in the country, and it also varied over time. In general, people started to take more sickness time. And this isn't just in Britain, it's also true of the rest of the Western world. And we're not quite sure why that's the case. Why did workers appear to be sicker in the 1890s? They took more sickness days off, here, you can see that, than they did at the start in the 1860s. It shows you the mean number of days off sick. It's a question that we'll try and answer. We can get at that information from that sickness table in the records. So this is where you come in. How can you help? Once we can get access to the archives, we'll photograph the remaining 45 years or so of our pension records. And we think that will be around about 20 to 23,000 individuals that we've still got left to take. I think, Jeffrey, I wonder if you could turn off your microphone. I'm going to mute you, if I may. Thank you. Just to come back, this is what Zooniverse is about. As soon as we can get access to the archives, we will be photographing more records and uploading them and asking people to do some of the transcriptions. If any of you are interested in photographing, in photography and photographing archives, then please get in touch with us either via our email address, which I'll show you at the end of the presentation, or you just drop me an email. We're looking for volunteers to go in. We have a setup, and obviously we would make sure, along with the museum, that it would be safe to do so. But if you're interested in helping with photographing those pension records so that we can get at that sickness rate, sickness information, then do get in touch. So coming soon, we hope. But what you can do now is take part in another transcription project, which is this one, which is the death certificates. We are in the process of gathering the death certificates for every one of our pensioners who died in the census years. That's from 1861 to 1901. There's about 3,000 of them, at least that's what we think. This is what a death certificate looks like, and it gives us, again, their occupation, it gives us the cause of death, how old they were, where they lived, how their death was certified, was it by a medical doctor or not. We can actually get quite a lot of information. We are in the process of buying these. Unfortunately, they don't come free. We have to pay for them. And we're gathering them together, and they will soon be available for transcription. We're going to use a Google form, which is something which I'm showing you on the right-hand side, and that will take you through what needs to be entered. This will start in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I know that if you've responded via the website, which is how I've got your details, you will have, most of you will, in fact, I think all of you have indicated that you would be interested in transcribing some of the death certificates. And we're going to try and do these on a single day when everybody can get together and we can answer your questions, and we can really have a kind of transcription fest, a bit like Who Do You Think You Are? Transcription Tuesday, which we took part in 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this is our next transcription project. It's coming very soon. We've got lots of death certificates stored up, and we'll be launching this in about 2 weeks' time. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for coming along and for listening. You can get more information from our website, and you can also drop us an email, either myself, and you've all got my email through the invite I sent through to you, or via the project email, which is addressinghealth@gmail.com. And if you're a Twitter user, do follow us at Postal Health. We're always posting tweets up there. So at this stage, I'm going to stop the presentation. I'll keep the recording on, but I'll answer any questions you might have. If you've got a question, I suggest you either raise your hand or type it in the chat, and we'll monitor it that way, and then I'll come to you in turn that I see on my screen.
David, we've got a question from Peter in the chat function.
Okay.
Certificates. Isn't a lot of info already on Find My Past Ancestry?
Thank you, Peter. Ancestry has census records and the post office appointment book, so we could in theory find out when somebody was appointed from there, but we can get that information from the pension records. They don't have the pension records, and the pension records give us the sickness rate, which is what we're really interested in. So unfortunately, Ancestry doesn't give us what we need. The records have not been digitized. We are hoping by photographing them, we'll then make these available to the Postal Museum as a digital archive. Ancestry might want to take them up at that point, but at present we can't use Ancestry for this part of the project. Find My Past is very useful particularly for newspapers, and we get a lot of our stories from newspapers. So if you're interested in some of the stories of these individuals, you can see those on our blog and also on the Postal Museum blog. This is where we get that detail.
Can I just interrupt, David?
Sorry, is that Peter?
It's Peter, yes.
Hello, Peter.
Can I just interrupt? My question about Find My Past and Ancestry was particularly about the death certificates.
About the?
Because some of that about the death certificates.
Yes. Well, you can access the death registers, which tells you when somebody died and the reference to their registration, but you've still got to get their death certificate. And for England and Wales, that means purchasing it, yeah. And for Scotland and Ireland, similarly.
Right. Okay.
Are there any other questions people wanted to raise? Peter, I see you have your hand up. Is that an old hand or a new hand?
It's a new hand.
New hand, far away.
I'd like to see that table you showed us of age of retirement and ill health. I'd like to see that.
Is it the it's the graph?
It's the graph, yes.
This one here.
That one there, yes. Age and ill health.
Yes.
I'd like to see that over different periods.
Indeed.
When there were significant changes, like, for example, poor law reforms, or the introduction of pensions, or indeed possibly even the 1872 Education Act.
Yes. Peter, so would we. This is one of the reasons why we need a large sample. We think there are around about 30 in total, around about 25 to 30,000 pensioners between 1858 and 1908. If we manage to get all of them, we'll be able to look at this on a year-by-year basis.
All right.
But and why that's one of the reasons why that's important is because we know, for example, that in the 1890s there was a very large flu pandemic. It's called the Russian flu. One of the things we're interested in is, do people in the 1890s have more sickness time off than, say, people in the 1880s when there wasn't a pandemic, at least not of that proportion? We'll be able to say, for example, that were workers who were born in the 1840s more or less healthy than those born in the 1850s at a similar age. But we can only do this with a large enough data set. And this is really why it's a 3-year project. It's going to take us another year to get the information we want. We've gone a long way, but we still have got, we're not even halfway through yet. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Any other question? Yes, Alan, and then Richard. Do open your microphone as well.
Yes, I've done. Yes.
Thank you.
If I'm interested in this photography,
yes,
of the records, can I do that locally, or does it mean travelling to somewhere special?
No, sadly, it means you have to be in London and you have to be able to get to the Postal Museum, because
I know
you
mentioned Derby University, so I thought that might be.
I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not. I mean, if there are local archives that we come across close to you, we'll definitely be calling on your help. And one of the things that we hope to do, which is the work that Laura and Emily are doing, is we're trying to link up with museums around the country to put on events related to the history of health. And there may well be one that we would want to work with in Leeds, so not too far away from you. But museums, like many places, are struggling to reopen, so it's all a little bit slow in that respect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Richard, I think you had your hand up next. Oh, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Need to unmute yourself. No, you're still muted. Can you, can you say something, Richard? Because I kind of can almost hear a sound. No, you're still muted, I'm afraid. I'm afraid you're still muted.
Would you be able to write it in the chat, Richard, instead, and then David can answer your question? There's also Hannah in the chat as well, David. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, I can't actually see the chat.
She says, how will you be contacting new people about the start date for transcription, Hannah?
Okay, we'll be emailing all the volunteers, which we have your emails, and we also have obviously our previous volunteers' emails. We'll be emailing everybody with exact dates of when something is going to start. We'll be giving you as much notice as we possibly can. Hopefully that's answered your question.
Margaret's got her hand up, and Anne Connaughton's got her hand up. Margaret,
should we go to you next?
Hello, yes. It's just two things really. Number one, this is my very first time at a Zoom meeting, so I'm following it with great interest. And number two, when I've volunteered in the discovery room and looked at some of the records, you find that even within occupational subgroups, you've got several levels of gradation. So, for example, you could have first, second, third, fourth, and fifth grade clerks, and on paper, at least, it's open to people to work their way up that particular hierarchy. So I'm just wondering whether it might be relevant, or perhaps research will reveal it anyway, how much these gradations within occupational groups in the GPO actually impact upon health well-being.
That's a very good point. It's something that we will be looking into because we've got that information. And in fact, we have a wonderful supporter called Alex, who has been a constant source of information for us. He's very knowledgeable. He's one of the Postal Museum volunteers. Emily, you may well know him. Alex has just compiled for us a detailed listing and description of different occupations in the post office, and we'll be posting that up on our website once we've had a closer look at it. So I don't think Alex is with us today, but Alex, if you ever see this video, thank you again for all your support and all your insight that you provided for us. But thank you, Margaret. That was a very helpful question.
Question from Richard. Is it not possible to do the next part via Universe? I assume that means Zooniverse is the platform.
Richard, we will be continuing to work with Zooniverse. The problem is that we've run out of photographs to upload because we've had such a fantastic response. Harry, I wonder if you want to say something perhaps a little bit about the response on Zooniverse and what will be happening next in response to that question. Perhaps you can unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Well, as David just said, the response has been very impressive. So we've uploaded 5 years worth of images in which, and in order to complete the transcription of those 5 years of images, we required 85,000 individual transcriptions to happen, and that was all polished off within about 4 weeks, which is, a tremendous rate of transcription. And so it's been very successful from the point of view of getting the material that we have transcribed. It's just unfortunately got through it, so quickly that there's now a little bit of a downtime before we can get more images. Those images will be forthcoming, hopefully relatively soon. Another year will go up, and it will continue adding years as we go along, and hopefully the response rate will continue to be very high. And the great thing so far is that not only has the rate of transcription been very fast, the quality of the transcription has also been really good. So if anyone has been contributing on the Zooniverse platform so far, thank you very much on both counts. I think if Richard was specifically talking about the transcription of the death certificates, whether that can be done on Zooniverse, I suspect there's a problem with copyright issues with death certificates, because they're so tightly controlled. The sort of reproduction of them is quite tightly controlled by the General Registrar Office. But again, I'm sure David can say a bit more about that. Yeah.
Thanks.
We've also got a question from John there. Do I have to enroll on the Addressing Health website and on Zooniverse?
They're slightly different things. Zooniverse is specifically for the transcription of the pension records. And once you've registered on Zooniverse, you'll be notified not just of our project, but also a range of different projects which require assistance. And that could be anything from spotting distant galaxies to listening to bat sounds and identifying different bat species. So it really is a very wide platform for different kinds of science and social science and historical projects. The website is our own in-house transcription, and we have different kinds of transcriptions there. The death certificates are a much more limited kind of transcription. They're a bit simpler to work through than the pension records, and there are obviously far fewer of them, maximum 3,000 compared to 30,000. So it doesn't really make too much sense to do the transcription of the death certificate through Zooniverse, because it would take less than a day at the current rate to achieve that. And we're interested in, although we obviously want the material transcribed, we've also learned an awful lot from our volunteers. And we don't just want you to kind of come and go in a day. We want you to stay with us, because we are constantly learning from you. So the more interaction we can have with our volunteers, the more rewarding and more interesting it becomes for us as well. I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions that have come up you haven't answered yet? No?
It's got a new hand up.
Oh, Peter. Oh, I see. Oh, Peter's hand went up, then it went down. Sorry, I don't know who's asking the question.
It's still meant to be up. I'm particularly interested in my great-great-grandmother, who was postmistress at a rural post office near Inverness in the, well, I'm not sure where, but in the latter half of the 19th century. Right.
Well, if she retired before 1908, we will eventually find her record.
Right. Is it possible to get her pension record and send it to me or something like that?
It will be, but what we're hoping is in a few weeks' time, I mean, maybe let's say a few months' time, we will have an interactive map available on the website, where you can go to your individual area, find out everything about all the postal workers who retired in that area, what they retired from, and see their pension record.
Well, that would be great. Yes, that would be wonderful.
But it will all, again, it's all dependent on us getting back into the archives and making this information available.
Okay, I understand that. That's fine. Thank you, David.
Yes.
Can you hear me, David?
I don't know who it is, but I can definitely hear someone.
Oh,
Yeah.
this is Diana.
Hello, Diana. Yes.
This is Diana. I'm just wondering, whenever we have read the information on the death certificates, what do we do with that information?
Very good question. Harry has written, has actually given a presentation on death certificates. Harry, do you want to say a little bit about it, and then I'll come in after you about how we might use death certificates?
Yeah, sure. So David touched on it very briefly in the presentation, but our primary interest in collecting all of this death certificate information is so that we can look at the relationship between the reasons that people retired from postal work and their causes of death. So, are people who retired with condition X then dying of condition X, but also do people who retire with certain conditions live longer than others? And how does that change over time? As anyone who's ever looked at 19th century death certificates can attest, the causes of death given are often more complex than you might imagine. So there's a lot of very vague definitions of causes of death given. There's a lot of very specific causes of death that now are not recognised as as actual medical terminology. There's medical terminology that is still used, but which now has different meanings. So rheumatism is quite a good example there. That's changed. The meaning of that's changed quite a lot over time. So we're very interested in this, in these sources. We also need to get enough of them so that we can work out exactly how to interpret the causes of death, and so that we can get a better understanding of how those causes of death relate to causes of retirement, which share a lot of the same problems in terms of interpreting the diagnoses given by 19th century doctors. So there's quite a few different reasons why we're interested in this, in the information that you can get from death certificates. Of course, there's also other stuff on the other information on death certificates other than the cause of death. So we'll also be interested in residents at time of death, so to see whether they've moved after they've retired. There's information on who reports the cause of death, so we can see whether it's going to be family members, people they were living with, strangers, etc. So there's a whole host of reasons why we're interested in these death certificates. Yeah.
But where do we put that information?
Thank you.
Do we put it into a spreadsheet, or what do we do with that information?
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for asking that, Diana. Following feedback, I'm just going to, hopefully, I'm not sure if you can see that screen. Harry, can you see a death certificate and a Google form?
Yeah.
Yep. Following feedback from some of the previous volunteers, where we did ask people to input information directly into a spreadsheet, we've changed the way we do things. We're asking people to put it into a Google form, which is more straightforward, and it takes you through question by question, ask you to put information into separate boxes. This isn't a live form, it just shows you the first bit of the form. But it's a little bit easier and a bit more friendly than just typing it into a spreadsheet where you've got the rows of data going across the page.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions at all at this stage? Peter, is your hand has gone up again? Yes.
My hand is up again. Well, I've got two questions, one of which is in the chat, but I've got another question. That is that on the Zooniverse, several volunteers transcribe each record, but what happens on the Google Forms and death certificates? Are you going to get several volunteers to do each certificate, or is it just going to be one certificate, one volunteer?
No, it's a good question. It's going to be one volunteer, one certificate, but every single one gets checked.
Oh, right. Okay.
So, for example, for the handwritten index, 21,000 lines of information, I have been through each single one myself, checking.
Oh, my goodness me. Right.
We've done some more transcriptions of Chief Medical Officers of Health annual reports. We have a few of those, and Harry has been checking all of those. So we check every single bit of data, information that comes into the project ourselves. Zooniverse is slightly different, it's slightly more automated, and there are special algorithms that help us go through those. But for the death certificates, it's a good old-fashioned double checking. You said you had a second question.
Yes, and that is that did staff get moved about by the post office to different towns?
It's a very good question. It's one of the things that we're looking at specifically in the project. But what seems to happen is that at the lower end of the state of the social scale, the postmen, the sorters, they tend to stay put, whereas the upper end, the postmistresses and postmasters, they move around a bit more because in order to get their promotion, they need to go to bigger offices. Mm-hmm. Whereas a postman would be able to get promotion through good conduct stripes. These are awarded, I think, every 5 years, and they include in addition to your salary. So yes, very good question, and it's something that we will be looking at as well. Any other questions before we wrap up this session?
David, there's one from Rosemary. She says she did some of the Zooniverse transcribing. Some of the reasons she came across for retiring was over 60. And she asked, how does this relate to illness?
Yeah. Over 60, we count as old age and is not health related. It depends where you were in the country. If you made it to 60 in London, you were doing pretty well. You were one of the 30% or so of people that made it to the end of their working lives. But elsewhere, 60 was not unusual. So old age is, in general, means the end of a working life. As long as you work for 10 years for the post office, you're eligible for a pension, and you got your full pension, which was, I believe, 2/3 pay, final salary as well, after 40 years of service. So you do get quite a lot of people retiring, having just done 40 years of service. Most of the reason for that would be down as superannuation or old age. Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and we will be starting the death certificate transcriptions, I think, in a couple of weeks' time. Once we've got enough images, we're ready to go, and you'll get an email from us telling you all the details of how to take part in that. If you haven't signed up for the newsletter on our website, by all means do that. I'll just go to the end of the, it's www.addressinghealth.org.uk. You can sign up for the newsletter there under the Learn More tab, and that will also be a way of keeping up to date with the project. You can email us at addressinghealth@gmail.com or via my own academic email address at King's, which you've all got. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will say goodbye now. If I haven't answered your question, I will go back through the chat and I will post answers to everybody. I'm sorry if I haven't got around to answering them, but thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure.